Some people will be dying in 30 years in Canada because we have not been responsible today.
Quote, in my view, climate change is the most severe problem that we are facing today, more severe even than terrorism. And I agree.
And what Kyoto was an acknowledgement that the rich countries are using far more of their share of the atmosphere.
This government still has no action plan. During their 8 years of dithering, CO2 emissions have skyrocketed.
We are facing a global crisis, Mr. Speaker. It is transforming the very planet in which we live.
Any delay in ratifying Kyoto means that our lack of courage will be paid for by future generations.
There are no short-term answers, but to fight it, this government will use every tool available.
We will decrease megatons, Mr. Speaker, of CO2, and we would make megatons of money with it, Mr. Speaker.
I used to agree with these dramatic warnings of climate disaster. I taught my students that most of the increase in temperature of the past century was due to human contributions of CO2. The association seemed so clear and simple. Increases of greenhouse gases were driving us towards a climate catastrophe. However, a few years ago I decided to look more closely at the science, and it astonished me. In fact, there is no evidence of humans being the cause. There is, however, overwhelming evidence of natural causes, such as changes in the output of the sun. This has completely reversed my views on the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, many other leading climate researchers also have serious concerns about the science underlying the protocol. So let's hear what you're not being told about climate change.
The field of climate science is vast, and I should emphasize rapidly evolving. Many things we thought we knew about the climate system just a few years ago are now proving to be highly uncertain or quite mistaken.
A common misconception amongst the general public is that temperatures are rapidly increasing. This is only with some of the surface data, and it's selected surface data. In fact, if much of the surface data that's collected is from around urban areas or areas which have had significant land use change, and this data is contaminated. On the other hand, satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Earth 24/7 for the last 20 years. And so what they have demonstrated is that there has been an almost imperceptible rise in temperature over this time.
But is there really much difference between temperatures in cities and that of the rest of the world?
I did studies in Winnipeg 25 years ago. We were measuring the heat island of the city of Winnipeg, and we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage and Main, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world are hotter than their surrounding environments. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide, and it has everything to do with land use.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
Occasionally when it is warm, everybody is saying, oh, it is global warming, like 98. It is not global warming, it is just El Nino.
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling. And the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
But surely climate change is happening. Do scientists have any doubt?
Climate always changes. It always has, and it always will, no matter what humans are doing.
And based on the paleoclimatic data that I and others have collected, it's obvious that climate is and always has been variable. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. It changes continually.
In a brochure sent to every household across the country, Environment Canada asserted that after 900 years of relatively constant temperature, the 20th century was suddenly warmer. The warmest in a millennium, they said. This was certainly different to what scientists had concluded before 1998.
past climate researchers have found out that over much of the world, between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperatures over many regions of the world called the Little Ice Age. Before that, there was a period of unusual warmth. So warming and cooling are the norm. The 20th century is not out of bounds compared to the past.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports. And then suddenly, in 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. Although Mann's research was never audited, the United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun that recent warming was unusual. Finally, in 2003, Canadian analyst Stephen McIntyre, in cooperation with Ross McKittrick of the University of Guelph, decided to take a closer look at the data.
We carried out an analysis of the results to see what happened when we recompiled the data, and got quite different answers. Instead of having an extraordinarily high 20th century, we had a 15th century value that was just as high as the 20th century. So the hockey stick disappeared. It's a computer programming error that yields these hockey sticks. This piece of the jigsaw puzzle needs to be removed before science can develop a proper understanding of the climate history of the last millennium.
Here's a study that appeared in the world's top science journal, and yet years went by and they never noticed that the data description that accompanied the paper was wrong, that there were very important methodological issues that weren't described in the paper.
Last year's Arctic Climate Impact Assessment made some very dramatic but highly unrealistic predictions. That the first graph to appear in the report is the hockey stick makes one naturally suspicious.
They made up what they were going to do beforehand and then chose whatever science they could find which they thought might support it. That's my view. They had another scare a few years ago because one of the people from the IPCC went on an Arctic cruise, you see, and he was absolutely amazed to find there was open sea. And he put an article in the New York Times saying, you know, this proves global warming. He had failed to notice that the Northwest Passage was first negotiated by a man called Roald Amundsen in 1906.
Recent research shows that 8,000 years ago, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees higher in the Arctic than today, and that dramatic changes occurred in only a few decades. Nevertheless, polar bears and other Arctic wildlife obviously adapted and survived, and so are also not threatened today.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today, and warmer even than they're forecasting for the most extreme global warming forecasts.
We frequently hear that the incidence and severity of extreme weather, such things as hurricanes, blizzards, droughts, and floods, are increasing, and that global warming is the cause. As editor of Natural Hazards, a leading scientific journal in the field, Dr. Murty has reviewed hundreds of papers on the topic.
Not a single manuscript out of these hundreds ever claimed global warming as the reason for extreme weather. Not a single one. I do not see any evidence of actual either numbers, that is the frequency or intensity of extreme weather events increasing.
Similarly, extreme weather expert Dr. Madhav Kandekar demonstrates that such events are not on the rise in Canada. But what about the massive Quebec ice storm of 1998 that many people blame on climate change?
There's nothing to say that it's humans that were responsible. And also, we cannot say that in future we won't have that kind of ice storms. If all those meteorological conditions will fall in line again, we will have a severe ice storm of that magnitude, if not even bigger.
The argument is that we're going to have an increase of drought, and it's another part of the scare tactics. That, well, more severe weather, more droughts, and so on. When you look at the long-term record, what you see is that droughts are cyclical. They do alternate, but you also see there are far worse droughts in the past than we've had in the modern record.
History shows that storm frequency and intensity is greatest in colder periods. The extreme weather of the Little Ice Age provides a good example.
The storms were much more dramatic. The storms would come in and wipe out villages along the northern coast, 400,000 people at a time. Storms not seen since.
If you take the long-term 500-year average, the maximum number of cyclones and storm surges in flooding in Western Europe was during that cold episode.
After last year's Florida hurricane season, many people fear such events will become more frequent as the earth warms.
Till few years ago, I believed that during warmer conditions, we'll have stronger cyclones. But as I look at observational data, it's showing exactly the opposite. Wherever we look, for reasons we do not quite understand yet, actually there are more cyclones when the atmosphere is a bit cooler than when it is warmer. Since 1980, not a single weather record has been set in terms of global cyclones.
But what about fears of catastrophic sea level changes that we are told will soon submerge small islands, such as the Maldives in the Indian Ocean?
That based on our most precise measurements, nothing unusual is happening. Again, some locations sea levels are rising, some locations they are falling. I have written a few papers also about Maldives, various aspects, and I do not see any evidence that anything unusual is happening in Maldives that cannot be attributed to natural climate variability.
The background increase in sea level rise has been about 20 centimeters per century for the last few thousand years. There is no scientific evidence whatsoever that this background rate is increasing.
So what causes climate change? Recent research indicates that the causes are mostly natural, and in many cases, not even originating on Earth.
There is much new evidence showing the sun has cycles over centuries. The Earth has warmings and coolings that follow in step with the sun. The sun's changes is one reason why the Earth has climate change.
In our research, we are showing the excellent correlation between the regular fluctuations in the brightness of the sun and earthly temperatures, and hundreds of other studies have shown similar trends.
There are so many things that affect climate, and some exciting news is that probably the galaxy affects climate as well. The galaxy affects the climate of Earth.
Trying to understand the causes of climate change is akin to putting together an extraordinarily complex jigsaw puzzle in which we are still missing many key pieces.
We haven't even got all the edge pieces, and we really haven't got some of the corner pieces. For example, the oceans. Our knowledge about deep ocean circulation, where you can have huge amounts of heat energy stored for up to 10,000 years.
While we should strive to minimize air, water, and land pollution, there is no need to concern ourselves about carbon dioxide.
What carbon dioxide is essential for life on Earth. Plants eat it, it is plant food, and in fact, as carbon dioxide has increased in the air over the last 50 years, plants have grown better, more vigorously, faster. Farmers have gotten a little extra bounty in their crops for free because there's more carbon dioxide in the air. Without carbon dioxide, there would not be life on Earth. We wouldn't be here. It is essential to us.
Research has shown that increases of CO2 concentration of 2, 3, 4, 5 times would not have a detrimental effect upon the Earth's biosphere.
University of Ottawa geology professor Dr. Jan Weiser has recently demonstrated that changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide have had little effect on Earth's long-term temperature in comparison with natural causes. The thick blue line at the top of this graph shows the changes in carbon dioxide in the past 500 million years. The red line below is a plot of temperatures found by Professor Weiser. Over this time frame, there is no meaningful correlation between carbon dioxide levels and Earth's temperature. In fact, when CO2 levels were over 10 times higher than they are today, about 450 million years ago, our planet was in the depths of the absolute coldest period in the last 500 million years. But what about the ice core records of the past 500 million years that show CO2 levels and temperature moving in lockstep?
When we look at the ice core record, here from Vostok in Antarctica, we see that the temperature record and the CO2 record from these ancient atmospheres follow very closely one to another. But when we look more closely at the detail, we see that the temperature record increases first. The CO2 record lags the temperature by up to 800 years. In other words, CO2 is acting as a result of temperature rise and not a cause of temperature increase.
When the Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters, and when the Vikings were farming in Greenland in soil that's now permanently frozen, the question is then what caused that warming? It certainly wasn't human-produced CO2.
And temperatures have not followed CO2 levels even in the 20th century. In fact, the world has been generally cooling since 1998 despite the continuing rise in CO2.
And then to add insult to injury to this idea that the influence of CO2 on climate, we actually had a decline in temperature from the 1940s through to about the late 1970s to about 1980. When all this while, CO2 levels were increasing like crazy all around the world.
CO2 is not the major greenhouse gas anyway.
In fact, if you wanted to categorize greenhouse gases, to paraphrase a colleague of mine, he says that greenhouse gas number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is water vapor, with carbon dioxide would be a distant 5. The celestial forcing of climate is the most important influence on our climate, with CO2 has an influence, but it's certainly not significant enough for us to worry about.
On the basis of this evidence, how could anyone still believe that the recent relatively small increases in CO2 levels that you see in Figure 3 of your handout would be the major cause of the past century's modest warming?
But didn't the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, conclude that human activities are causing disastrous climate change? No, they did not. Most government and media get the wrong impression by only reading the summaries for policymakers, the alarmist and misleading overviews of the IPCC's science reports.
Now, this summary for policymakers isn't a summary for policymakers at all. It's a summary by policymakers. In other words, it is a summary which is agreed line by line by government representatives.
But didn't the IPCC establish that our release of greenhouse gases caused the past century's modest warming?
They have not established that greenhouse gases are warming the Earth. And what's more, in Chapter 1, there is a statement by the author of that chapter which states very clearly that in their opinion, although there have been changes in the climate, they could very well be natural. One of the biggest spoofs of the IPCC is that they try and play down the fact that the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor.
Among the many problems with the IPCC, perhaps the most serious is that research is selected to support their point of view without proper audit. The hockey stick fiasco is a prime example.
So as we look at the report itself, there's one graph that comes out over and over, and that's the hockey stick graph. They think so much of it, they have it twice on the same page here, and you just can't miss the hockey stick. It's the central icon for the IPCC's argument.
All of these multi-proxy studies need to be looked at from top to bottom prior to their incorporation in the next round of UN studies. Clearly, between the journal publication and its use by IPCC, somebody somewhere should check the calculations.
Although Dr. Murty and Dr. Gray were official reviewers of the IPCC reports, their input was ignored.
they sometimes take notice of your comments. I mean, they don't take much notice of mine because most of the time I don't agree with what they're saying.
But later when I saw the final document, not a single comment from me was taken into account.
The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
Where the governments have placed all their belief in the IPCC have placed all their faith in the computer models.
If you want to put in everything that one thinks is relevant to the climate system in the model, it would encompass 5 million different variables.
There is not a computer in the world with the capacity to handle the data, but more important, to handle all of the calculations of interaction and complexities of the climate.
The forecasts of a 1.5 to 4.5 degree increase in temperature are made by computer models that are incapable of properly handling the most important greenhouse gas of all, water vapor.
Now, the Antarctic has had measurements made for the past 50 years, and it's cooling, you see. And this is the opposite of what the models predict, and they have an awful trouble trying to figure this out.
Really, we can't put much emphasis on climate models. We have a lot of problems with them. Maybe some decades from now we may have satisfactory climate models, but right now they are very unsatisfactory.
Governments need a totally new way to approach the science of climate change.
But what they can't have is a situation where people just yank a paper out of the literature without having done any kind of analysis of it or verification of it and say, on this basis, we're going to start spending billions of dollars. That's just a recipe for disaster.
If Canada's government is to base climate policy on real science, then they must accept that their policy decisions should be changeable as climate science advances. Otherwise, policy becomes disconnected from science, and we may waste billions of dollars going in entirely the wrong direction.
There is no doubt, however, that natural climate change will be hard on some people, so we need to help them adapt.
So where the resources should go is to adopt it. How to adapt to climate. Don't fight climate change, adapt to climate change. That is basically what we should be looking at.
Speaking out, as we have on this video, is uncomfortable and distracts us from the work we love. But scientists have a serious obligation to advise society to look at this issue. We sincerely hope that you will look at the facts and weigh the consequences of Kyoto. It is surely one of the most misguided endeavors of our age.